Hey, welcome back. Rob here from Ram Studio Comics. In today's video, I'll be drawing two different hand poses with you and also talking about things I look for when constructing these. And this will be in a little bit more of a comic style and with the comic style rendering. So hopefully you enjoy that. And without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so with the fist, I lightly sketch this in. And whenever I draw a fist, I try to think about the knuckles, the orientation from the knuckles that are closer to the thumb from this perspective and the knuckles that are on the back of the hand, that they both have a slight curvature to them. So I imagine a line. Sometimes I'll physically draw it in, but they're curves that are actually opposite of one another. So the curve for the knuckles that are closer to the thumb would bend towards our view at this point, and then the opposite for the knuckles on the back of the hand. So I think about that, but then when I go to draw the fingers, I try not to adhere too tightly to that because fingers have, in this case, this particular pose, they have a very subtle difference in orientation from one to the other. They're obviously all side by side, which can actually confuse us when we go to illustrate this and make us draw it very boxy, very rigid. But the hand isn't really that rigid. It's actually pretty organic in a lot of ways. It has a lot of range of movement. So what I tend to do is just make sure that each one of the fingers are pointed just a little bit differently. Now, obviously, the separation that we get from the middle finger and the ring finger is that line that comes right down to the center of the palm. So that's a guiding factor right there. Typically, the thumb doesn't really pass the middle finger. Obviously, that can change based upon how you squeeze your hand together. The pinky generally kind of pushes inward into the palm, so it tucks in more than the other fingers. So that's another thing that you have to kind of pay attention to. And a common thing in comics is to draw the pointer finger up away from the other fingers. So hopefully you can see I tried to do that here. I think I kind of failed a little bit on that, but it is there. It's just not as evident as I wanted it to be. So when that happens, the knuckle of the pointer finger will dip down, obviously, and then the knuckle closer to the thumb will pop up a little bit. But I think the real reason a lot of people will do that isn't so much that you see it in every fist pose that you make. Like if you clench your fist, it's noticeably that way, but it's not very noticeable. A lot of times in comics, they'll over exemplify or over illustrate that area because they're basically trying to get away from the overly rigid feel that you'll get to a hand or boxy feel that you'll get to a hand if you don't show that difference in the fingers. So again, the fingers are just very malleable. They have a lot of different ranges, and you see that. So it's subtle, and I think that's what makes drawing a fist kind of tough to do at first because it's very easy to misinterpret it and just draw it very squared off, very rigid, and ultimately kind of lose some of the life that you can have for even something like a closed hand pose like this. So for the next one, I wanted to go with a more stressed hand pose. To me, this is like a character shooting power, energy, something like that. So obviously these are probably two of the most popular poses for comics, but I kind of wanted to test today's video with you and see what you thought about doing it in this format where we illustrate a couple poses, we quickly go to inks and stylize it, obviously adding some shadow and some rendering as well. So be sure to let me know in the comments section below what you think about it, and I'll know if I should bring you more of these or less of these. So with this one, the thing that I probably pay attention to the most is, again, the orientation of the fingers in relationship from one another. So the fact is that the fingers can separate pretty dramatically, right? And I tend to notice in a natural representation of this type of pose that the middle finger and the ring finger separate just a little bit more than the rest. Now that could just be what I see when I'm looking at hand poses like this, or even in my own hand. Like, this is the tricky thing. I always say reference your own hand when you're doing this, but then we all have different hands. So it's possible that like you have a weird hand, I have a weird hand. So when we go to draw this, maybe that comes through in our artwork, but regardless, the best representation or the best reference you have is your own hand. It's right there in front of you. I've heard plenty of artists say that. It's like, just really make use of that. Put a mirror by your art table. Obviously phones, you can take selfies of your hand. It sounds kind of weird, but it works out really well. And pay attention to these things. So again, the orientation of the fingers is quite different. I notice a pocket in the palm. So as you bring your thumb forward, you're going to see more of the webbing. The webbing of from the pointer finger to the thumb is going to become more noticeable, and then also the pocket in the palm will become more noticeable. And that's why I added the heavier shadow in there. So the other thing I noticed is that the pinky and the thumb seem to always have this relationship of, like a kind of like a claw, pinching or whatever. It's not exact, obviously. It's not like we have two thumbs or anything like that. Like maybe some people do, but then, it's basically that if you make this kind of hand pose, there's a relationship there that's kind of noticeable. So I always pay attention to that. I always pay attention to the fact that the middle finger is larger. Now I kind of misillustrated that here, because if you notice in my illustration, the pointer finger and the middle finger are almost carbon copies. So right there, that shows me there's a mistake there, and probably a few mistakes in this illustration, but that's one that's more noticeable. So again, I have to be aware of that. Like the middle finger should be noticeably larger and a bit more dominant. It's that dominant finger that we like to throw up there when we're upset with people, right? So, so thinking about little things like this can go a long ways. Now, another thing that I tend to notice is the pads below the fingers, so that, the rounded kind of bulbous parts of the other side of the knuckles, so the inner palm area, they can look really rounded at points. But in this case, one of the flaws that I see here is that I made, again, a carbon copy of the pad under the fingers of the pointer and middle finger. So I don't think it's horrible, but it's again, one of those things where in the human body, if you see anything that's repetitive, chances are it's wrong, because the body is just so different from area to area. There's not really symmetry. There's symmetry from side to side, but not within components of, the hand or whatever part of the body we're talking about. There's almost no symmetry in that regard. So again, repetitiveness is kind of something that will point out that there's a bit of a problem. And also with light and shadow, you want there to be a feeling that the shadow is affecting parts of the hand differently. So the fact that they're too repetitive just kind of shows that there's a bit of an inaccuracy there. So I do want that feeling that they're kind of rounded, but I don't want spherical shapes right there either. So just remember that when you're doing your shadows, kind of a way to fight that natural reoccurrence in your work is to try to cut in with angles. So you probably notice I tried to do that a bit here. A lot of these shadows aren't just rounded around the form. There's a bit of angles in there, and you can really play around with that and take that a lot further than what I've done here. But again, one of the things that I tend to pay attention to is that if I have that effect where things look like a mirrored copy, especially side by side, but even throughout areas like this, it really detaches away from the natural feeling that you get with something like a hand. Now, the other thing is the shadow on the back of the hand. So I feel like the shadow just seems forced. So I definitely wanted that shadow there. I think it's a little contradictory to the light source. That tends to be another thing that I can struggle with at times. So again, it's identifying with it and then trying to correct it as I go. I think I could have gotten that done a little bit better with just some light cross hatching. But that's where videos like this are really great in your own work, because you can look at the stuff in a retrospect and really gauge, hopefully gauge where some of your mistakes are. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. More content is on the way very soon. As always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and bye for now.